Welcome to Reflections on Gaming, where we talk about, you guessed it, games. We talk about what makes gaming such a passion in our lives, and how looking critically at games can open up our ability to learn more about ourselves and other media and pop culture. This week, we want to look at Kiersey and Bartle's player types, how they relate to personality types, and what that means when we try to have fun with our games. I'm Jordan.
I'm Weston. So if you've listened to this podcast before, you probably have heard of the Bartle player types a little bit from discussions we've had in the past. And we've gotten quite a few number of people telling us that they want to hear a little bit more about the player types. So we decided that today we would take kind of a deep dive, not only into the Bartle player types, but also into the Kiersey player types, and kind of examine them, not only what they are, but how they influence us and how they can influence developers in the gaming scene as well.
Right, so we're not trying to get super deep or analytical with any of these things. We want to present this as kind of an introduction to these player types and temperaments, and just kind of give people a good overview of these ideas and hopefully correlate them to this interest of ours of playing video games and kind of your broader life in general, showing you, if you think that this is the kind of person you are, then perhaps selecting interests around this personality type will help you get more enjoyment out of what you're doing in your free time. So with that, we'll start by talking about Bartle's player types. These are probably the most well-known if you're in game development or just kind of into that kind of knowledge sphere of learning about those kinds of things. So we'll start with most rudimentary.
So the Bartle player types fall on, the ones we talk about today, they're classified based on kind of two axes of determination. So the Bartle player types, the four of them are the killers, the achievers, the explorers, and the socializers. And each one of those falls in kind of one of the four quadrants on these axes, which are whether a player enjoys acting on a world or players, or interacting with a world or interacting with players. And depending on where you are, obviously, most people aren't only a killer or only an explorer. They don't just like interacting with the world and hate interacting with other players and hate also acting on the world. But most people kind of lean into one of those and are a little bit kind of in the middle on the others. And some people might not. Killers are generally, like, being a killer is indicative of really enjoying kind of dominating other people. You really like to have everything go your way. You're very competitive, and you like to succeed and to win at the expense of other people being able to win or other things in the world being able to win. So someone might not really enjoy that, but they might not hate it either. It's just not what they really look for in a game. It's not their first instinct in a game. So they might be more of an explorer, but everyone kind of has a little bit of all four within them.
Right, and just to make it clear, with the killers versus achievers versus explorers versus socializers, while you're going to lean towards one, you are inevitably going to be a little bit of everything, and so it's important to kind of self-evaluate and see how far you are to one side or the other, and try to figure out what it is that you enjoy out of things. And depending on the game that you're playing, you might be a different kind of player. For example, if you're interested in competitive multiplayer games, specifically first-person shooters, then you might love playing Call of Duty online and ranking up and using your skills to take out other players. But you're also interested in a game like Overwatch. And in Overwatch, you like to play as a support character because you know that your skills perhaps aren't good enough to take on the other players, but by helping your team, you achieve that victory and that makes you happy. Both of those could be in that killer sphere, but the way that they're tapping into that kind of ideology is different. So these things aren't really clear cut. They're not super precise, and we're not going to tell anyone if they're one thing or the other. This is more of a personal kind of what you're interested in, and eventually talking about how games can tap into these to really push forward the medium and try to achieve the biggest birth of audience that they can get with the kind of game that they're interested in producing.
Right. These, regardless of whether somebody recognizes where they fall in the spectrum, everyone has kind of games that they gravitate towards, right? And so we'll talk about it a little bit more later, but it's important for developers to kind of understand these so that they can mold their game. They can understand who they're making it for, what they need to put into it to make it for those people and make it appealing and make it fun for those people, and also how to make it appeal to, kind of everyone with a focus on maybe one of these 4 quadrants, but also just how to get people to understand what kind of game it is, because everybody's attracted to certain kinds of games. And if you see a game that there have been games that someone sees and maybe they don't realize that it has aspects that are interesting to them because they're not obvious in like the trailers and the promotional materials and the reviews. And so it's kind of important to recognize that it does have a major influence on developers and players alike, in that you might find a game that you were really expecting to like, but then the thing you were drawn to turns out to be a really minor part of the game or is badly done. And so it's really important for developers and players to kind of, it's almost like a symbiotic relationship, that the developers need to understand these types so that they can make it for the players, and the players don't necessarily need to understand, but they just kind of inherently are attracted to these things to support the developers.
Right. And I think that we've been getting a little muddled with the portions that we're talking about. So let's get back to the meat of these 4 types, with the killer, socializer, explorer, achiever. The ideology behind the killer, like we said, is where you're acting on another player. Your thing is you like to be playing with other real people, and you like to win. That doesn't necessarily mean you are killing other people, but you are in some way acting towards a goal that achieves something, some kind of win condition. On the other side of the spectrum of people that are interested in playing with other people is a socializer. They're not necessarily working towards an end goal of winning. They just want to achieve something with other players. So, you could be playing a kart racer and you don't really care if you win or you lose. You're just interested in playing with your friends. You could be playing an online big ol' MMORPG, and really, you're not interested in going and fighting the raid bosses. You're just interested in hanging out with your friends in this online place. You're interested in getting some cool armor sets to show off, or you want to make your personal home base, or whatever it's called, the coolest one, or the one with the special achievement trophies that no one else has. So, socializers and killers are both on the spectrum of wanting to play with other people, but the way that they are interacting with that system with other players is different. Killers want to act on other people or act on the game, whereas socializers are interested in interacting with the world or with other players.
So on the other side of killers and socializers is the people who are less interested in the players and playing with other people, and they're more interested in the world itself, the world within the game. So achievers are similar to killers in that they enjoy acting, but rather than acting on other people and other players, they enjoy acting on the world instead. They like to push the game to its limits. They like to see they like to be able to, like, trophies. Most games have trophies nowadays. They like to conquer a game, and a lot of trophies nowadays are very difficult to get. Good example is like the Dark Souls and the Bloodborne, right? some of the things you have to do to get the trophies in those games are crazy. They're already really difficult games to begin with, and the platinum trophy and the gold trophies are just sometimes ridiculous, but achievers really enjoy working toward those things, and they feel like because they're acting on the world itself, they're acting on the game, and they're really conquering it. And on the other side of that, rather than acting on the world, are the explorers, who enjoy interacting with the world, who like to see everything that the game has to offer. And Jordan, what would you say a little bit more about the explorers? Because you know a little bit more about this stuff than I do.
Well, so for explorers, they like to interact with the world in a way that isn't necessarily what you would think. Obviously, hearing about interacting with the world, you'd probably think all along the lines of they want to learn about the story, they want to learn about the game mechanics and this and that and the other thing. But when we talk about an explorer, a killer, a socializer, achiever, we're talking about the quintessential, most people would not be this person, but if there were a person, this is what they would do. And an explorer is the kind of person who is looking at the game not necessarily inside of its boundaries to try to learn everything they can. So they might do more than just play the game and do all the side quests to learn the story. They might do more than just learn the game mechanics and try to maximize their efforts. They might go to forums online and learn about the creator and learn about the production and learn everything they can so that they don't understand just the world within itself, but they understand everything about the world. A good example of this might be with Pokemon. If you are someone who is an explorer in Pokemon, a regular kind of explorer, not this extreme, then you would be content with just, seeking out those special Pokemon in areas that aren't necessarily told to you, figuring out the best balls to use to capture the Pokemon, figuring out what types are best against other types, and not just that, but like who is it that you're going to be coming up against next. The really extreme explorers, and there's other people that might enter into this territory as well due to what it does. The really extreme explorers are going to go online and they're going to be like, what isn't the game telling me? And they're going to learn all about egg groups and EVs and end game content and the metagame and all these things that I don't want to get too deep into because I'm not a huge fan of Pokemon and don't know that much about these subjects. But a casual person playing the game versus a hardcore explorer learning everything they can about the game are going to have vastly different experiences because they're going to understand vastly different things about the game.
Yeah, so maybe just one other example. Kind of to tie all four into, I'm going to use Dark Souls as an example. In Dark Souls, as a killer, you'd be that dude that enjoys invading other people's worlds and just wrecking them and just destroying them. As an achiever, you'd be the one who enjoys seeking out every single boss and every single enemy in the game and defeating all of them. As a socializer, you'd probably be the person who enjoys calling in your friends and facing all the bosses together. You're more about the interacting with your friends and kind of going at it with teamwork rather than just dominating yourself. And as the explorer, you'd be the person who can actually parse out the ridiculous lore of the Dark Souls series through all the item descriptions and going online and trying to figure out how every single one connects together. Just as kind of like a basic outline of what all four are kind of about.
Right, so those four types do a pretty good job of encompassing the types of things people are looking for in a game. The Kiersey temperaments, which kind of go hand in hand but are not the same as the Bartle player types, aren't looking so much at what a game offers you in content and more of a kind of gray area of how you play the game. So, for example, Dark Souls has in-game mechanics that allow you to tap into the explorer, socializer, killer, achiever, but there's no such thing as game mechanics that are for these temperaments, because it's how the player interacts with the mechanics that kind of dictate this. And in the same way that the Bartle types are on this two-axis scale between playing with players versus playing in the world, and interacting with the world versus acting on the world, or interacting with players versus acting on players, the Kiersey temperaments have a scale between internals and externals, and change and structure. The internals is something within the game versus externals is something kind of not necessarily to do directly with the game, but surrounding the game, such as the metagame or other people playing it, anything like that. Maybe even YouTube channels where people are looking to kind of learn more things about it. And then change versus structure, with change being I am doing something that isn't necessarily designed in the game for it, versus structure of I'm going to use the in-game mechanics to the best way I can.
Yeah, this one is really, the Kiersey temperaments are really interesting, because from those, he again separates it into four major types of people, and the kind of like Jordan said, the kind of experiences that they're seeking out of a game. So the people who are focused, who lie in the change and externals quadrant, are the artisans. And the other way that they're kind of explained is that they're seeking sensations. They want the power to be free to act any way that they want. They want to act at will on people and things, and they just want, they're focused less on the internal of the game. They're more focused on the things that aren't necessarily tied to the game, but they want freedom to act on those things.
I think these temperaments are a little difficult to wrap your head around, just because they're kind of based on what people are doing rather than the game itself. But a good way to think about the artisan is they aren't interested in being constrained by the game. They want to do whatever they want in spite of what the game is letting them do. A good example of this might be speedrunners. Speedrunners are less interested in what the game lets them do and more interested in what they can do within the game itself. So if the game is telling them you're not allowed to go through this wall, they might say, well, I don't care what you think. I want to go through that wall because it's going to shave 15 seconds off of my time. And so they're going to try to find some way to act on that world and change it to be what they want. And hopefully that makes it a little easier to put this artisan ideology in perspective of they want to do what they want with this like it's a toy rather than being immersed in it like it's a world.
Right. Yeah, they're definitely a little bit more difficult than the Bartle types to really understand and explain. Obviously Jordan has you have a lot more experience and kind of depth of knowledge for these kinds of things. But on the other side of the spectrum from the artisans, who are still focused on externals but are less about change and more about structure, are the guardians. And the guardians, the way that they're described within the Kiersey system is that they want security of possessions obtained by following the rules. Now, my interpretation of that, and Jordan, feel free to correct me if I'm totally wrong on this, but to me, it kind of speaks to people who enjoy the achievement, but they want to be able to share it with outside, like with other people.
That's not a bad way of putting it, but that's probably incomplete. Definitely thinking of it in terms of they're the kind of people that want to achieve something, But if there's some way to break the game to achieve it, they would say, well, that defeats the purpose. What's the point of achieving it if I cheat to earn that achievement? But they're also the kind of person who would be, going back to Dark Souls, they would enter into the covenant where if someone is being invaded, they would be pulled into that person's world to help defend them. And the idea is they want everyone to have fun within the limits of the game. They don't want people to cheat. They don't want people to be fighting with each other, and they're willing to defend and do what they can to kind of fix that. And the biggest difference between an artisan and a guardian is that they're not necessarily concerned with the constraints on the game itself, so much as they are concerned on the constraints of the people playing the game. So if there's an MMO RPG or an MMO FPS, you may at times find people queuing in the game world into these massive lines to do something. The game is created in such a way that this shouldn't be an issue. People shouldn't have to wait in line to do something. But because of some error, some bug, or just an oversight, sometimes it happens that people need to wait to achieve something. And some people would be, hey, free for all, let's do whatever we can. But the people who are guardians are going to say, no, there needs to be order. I was here after this person, so I'm going to wait my turn. And they love it when people follow that trend and make it so that everyone can achieve this thing, everyone can play the game in a way that makes sense to them. And, you know, like I said, these cues aren't internal to the game. This isn't something the game forces you to do. It's external. It's people's choices outside of this game environment that leads to the cues forming. And that's kind of the idea of this structure, but outside of the game world itself.
On the other side of Guardians that are still focused on structure, but they're more focused on internals rather than externals, are rational people. And they're also just rational
players, not necessarily
That's
rational
an important
people.
distinction to make, in fact. They're also described as being knowledge seeking. For me, assuming that I understand this, these types of players are definitely the easiest for me to wrap my head around within these temperaments. They're the kind of people that, like we were talking about earlier, they kind of want to master the game, and they're not that interested in anything outside of the game. They're focused on everything, all the experiences within the game and surrounding the game, and they're not interested in changing the game necessarily or breaking it. They just want to experience everything the game has to offer within the bounds that the game has set for them.
I think rational players, they thrive on a game that gives them something to do. We have mentioned before that neither of us are big fans of Grand Theft Auto as a series, in spite of the fact that it is a hugely successful juggernaut in the gaming world. And it's because while there are at times some structured events that you can go through, they aren't exceedingly interesting. The overall gameplay of the Grand Theft Auto series isn't incredibly engaging, and this is not a knock at them. It's just they have so much going on in the games, they don't have an incredible amount of refinement in any particular thing. It's all good, but none of it is great. And so when we, who tend to be rational players, are put into these worlds, aren't interested in the structure that is being put into place, we lose interest because we're not interested in all the external things that we can do, all these, things that you can play with other people online, you can beat up random citizens, you can street race, you can do all these crazy things. It loses its luster for us very quickly. Whereas games like RPGs tend not to have too much content outside of the main quest line until near the end. And of course, that's not true of all games, but RPGs tend to be very structured, and even the parts that aren't directly given the player have a lot of structure around them, about, you know, where you can go, who you can fight, what weapons you can use, what magic you can use, all these different things. And it's kind of a security blanket for people who are looking for that. I want to be told what to do so that I can do it the best I can. I don't want you to tell me do whatever you want, because then I don't know what I want. And that is kind of the quintessential rationalist
Yeah, I think just adding
player.
on to that with GTA, you know, a lot of the most popular streamers and YouTube videos having to do with GTA are often self-imposed challenges with different ways that they're breaking the game or they've modded the game. And, you know, you give that to people like us, who probably fall much more into the rational player quadrant. And it's like, I don't really care that I can do all those things. I'd rather just have a goal like within the game given to me that I can work towards. And I don't mind if you give me lots of different paths, but I want them all in the game. I don't want to be just told to go free reign, go do whatever you want. I want the specific goal to work towards. And I don't want to have to leave the game, especially, and go somewhere else and put new things into the game to find those goals and to make my own fun with them.
Right. The final temperament for the Kiersey types is the idealist. And these are people who are interested in change, but on the internal world. So these are people who they want to do something interesting within the boundaries of the game itself. Good example of this are people who like to min-max. They like to find some exploitable system in the game and then have their fun with it. A good example of this would be Final Fantasy VIII. Final Fantasy VIII had a number of systems that, working in tandem, led to very interesting kind of rules. In most Final Fantasy games, there is no world leveling system. This idea is that in a world leveling system, your level directly influences the enemies that you encounter in the world, and increases their difficulty to scale with your current prowess. Personally, I'm not a big fan of this because it makes it so you can't just absolutely dominate some enemies, but that's a discussion for another time. Final Fantasy VIII does do this. The higher your level, the more difficult enemies and bosses in the game become, which means that in a perfect world, you could receive 0 levels in the game and make the game easier for you. Or at least achievable. There is another system in this game called the junction system, which is too complex to get into now, but suffice it to say, you correlate a specific type of magic with a specific value on your character, such as health, physical attack, magical attack, anything along those lines, and it increases those attributes. So a lot of people, when Final Fantasy VIII came out, played the game in the normal way. They played it by leveling up and putting magic on their stats and beat the game, and they had a grand time, and there's nothing wrong with that. People who are idealists, they're looking to kind of change this world, use it as a canvas, but not go outside of it, learned that the level of things was based on their level, and that they could really work the junction system to incredibly overpower their players. And they did as much as they could so that they could kill just about anything in the game in one hit, which is ludicrous in an RPG. That almost never happens. But that's what they're looking for. They're looking to achieve something outside of the norm within this to kind of stand out.
Yeah, so with all of that, to just kind of summarize, with the Bartle types, we have killers, achievers, explorers, and socializers. And with the Kiersey temperaments, we have artisans, guardians, rational players, and idealists. And I'm sure you've noticed as we've talked about these, that there is a bit of overlap between the types of players and the temperaments we've discussed. And when you kind of put them together and you look at them together, there is quite a bit of overlap, but it also leaves room for even more gray areas for someone to fit in somewhere between killers and achievers on the Bartle types, and somewhere between artisans and idealists on the temperament types, on the temperaments, and you're just kind of somewhere in the middle, some combination of all three of those quadrants. So it's impossible to, I mean, not impossible, but very, very difficult to really nail down where a single player might fit into any one of these quadrants. But by analyzing yourself and by analyzing your own preferences when it comes to games, you might be able to recognize within yourself, oh, I'm a bit of a rationalist, but I also really enjoy socializing, so I'm kind of more in the socializing area of the Bartle type, but I maybe fall a little bit more towards the rational quadrant of the Kiersey temperaments. And from there, you can just recognize, what kinds of games you might be interested in the future, kind of look around for other games that fall within that type of game experience.
Right, and there's another type of model that tries to look at what makes people interested in playing games by Chris Bateman. And we don't want to get too deep into it, but he kind of put the Kiersey and Bartle temperaments together and then added to their models to try to better replicate the kinds of people that tend to play games. As we said before, most people are not just a killer or just an achiever or just a socializer, etc. They're a little bit of everything. Well, what Chris Bateman did was he put the killers and artisans, socializers, idealists, he put all these types and these temperaments together, matched them into these quadrants where it best fit, and then kind of created these very broad areas where he says, these are the kinds of people that gamers tend to talk about. You've got the casual gamer versus the hardcore gamer. You've got people who just like to participate. You've got the people who like to manage. You've got the people who like to conquer. And you've got the people who like to wander. So the casual players he placed in between the achievers and the killers, or the guardians and artisans. And the idea is that they're not super interested in the game world itself. They don't care if there's a lot of lore or a really nice story or anything like that. They like to casually play games with other people. And whether they like to conquer other people, or they just like to hang out with other people, or they're looking to achieve something, they're the casual kind of audience. On the other side of the spectrum, you've got the hardcore gamers, which is not to say that they are better. It's just to say that they tend to get much more involved in the games and the game culture. These tend to be people who are between socializers and explorers. Whether they be rational gamers or idealist gamers, this is kind of where they're at. These are the people who really want to get into, what lore does this game have? Is it good lore? Does it make sense? Is it funny? Is it horror? Is it dramatic? Like what's going on here? Are there other games in this series? Is there other media I can read up on? Are there YouTubers? Are there Twitch streamers? Are there speedrunners? It's the people who really get into gaming as more than just a passing hobby, and more of something that they like to invest their time, money, and effort into.
Yeah, down by the what he placed between explorer and achiever were the conquerors, which are the people that they pick up a game and they are committed to it until they have basically exhausted the game to its utmost. They've found every secret, they've gotten every achievement, they've done every mission, they've beaten every enemy, they've beaten every boss, they've found all the secret bosses, they've done everything that the game has to offer within its own world. And on the other side, between the socializers and the killers, or the artisans and idealists, you have the wanderers. And wanderers aren't necessarily committed to a game like the Conquerors are. In fact, they may not be committed at all. They're just there for a good time, and they're not that interested in finding everything the game has to offer, but they have that one thing that they love to do that might be with a lot of other people, and they are really, really good at it. And they play that one thing a whole lot, and they don't really care about the rest of the game, but they play that one thing a whole lot, and that might bounce to a lot of different games where they're having kind of those one and done experiences rather than the Conquerors who are doing everything the game has to offer before moving on to the next one.
Right, those are the kind of people that they play whatever game is hot right now. They're the kind of people who are like, Fortnite is dead, Apex Legends is the new hot thing, or Call of Duty Warzone, or whatever. And let's make this clear, there's nothing wrong with any of these different player types. This is just a way of people to kind of look at, what is it that I'm actually interested in? And what are the people, if I want to play with other people, what are they interested in? If you're the kind of person who's a hardcore killer, and you meet someone else who's also a hardcore killer, hey, that might be great. But if you guys are interested in two different games, maybe not so great, because your skills from one game to another game do not necessarily translate, especially if you know a lot about specific maps, specific metagame, or anything like that. It can be hard to pull someone else who's very similar to you into the game that you're playing. But if you're a killer and you find someone who's a wanderer, where they don't care so much what they're playing, they just want to hang out with their friends and, win some matches, well, then you saying, hey, I'm good at this game, you want to play with me, they're probably going to be all good to jump on board and play with you. So it's good to look at, kind of where you're at and maybe where other people are at, to give you a better understanding of how you can enjoy your gameplay experience. And the last two kind of sections that Chris Bateman created are the manager and participant. Both are kind of on the structure side of things rather than the changing side of things. But the difference is between whether they are leading or whether they are taking part in. And a good example of this would be in an MMORPG where you have guild leaders and guild members. A manager would be a guild leader. They're the person who is totally down for organizing all these people, coming up with your next raid boss plan, figuring out who should be in what roles, and just having a great time kind of leading people. They're not necessarily interested in achieving something on their own, but they want to be directing people to achieve something. A participant is, just like it says, someone who isn't necessarily interested in leading, but they want to achieve something. And they want to, their desire to achieve it is large enough that they're totally willing to take someone else's lead to be able to accomplish it. Outside of MMORPGs, another example might be in the Dark Souls franchise, summoning someone to help you beat a boss. If you want to beat the game, but you're not quite good enough, or you don't want to spend all that much time, or there's something that you're missing in terms of knowledge, well then, let me just summon this other person. They can show me what to do. Well, now you're a participant, and maybe they're a manager. They might just be another participant that knows a little bit more, and they're just interested in doing this thing because they're having a good time. But the idea is kind of a leader versus a follower, and the ideology of we both want to achieve something, but how much we want to invest in achieving it may be slightly different.
We just want to emphasize, this is by no means a comprehensive list, and lots of people will, maybe even though they fall into one of these specific categories very well, they might only fit into that category for one game. You might have a completely different type of playing an FPS. You might be much more of a wanderer or a casual in FPSs, but then as soon as you pick up an RPG, you might be hardcore or a conqueror or even a manager if it's an MMORPG. Depending on what you're playing, what you're interested in, you might take very, very different roles in whatever games you happen to be playing, and you might not fit into any of these things particularly well, and you might be a little bit of A, a little bit of B, depending on your mood and depending on when you're playing and depending on what you're playing. But this is all, it's just kind of fuel for conversation, for understanding a little bit more how gamers work and how games are built around these types of gamers. And we're always open. We'd love to hear other people's thoughts about these, and we'd love to hear your thoughts about these. And at this point, after we've talked about all these player types quite a bit and we've expounded upon a lot of them, we'd love to hear what you have to say. And if you have any comments, questions, if you super disagree with something we said, or if you have a little bit more knowledge about some of these things that you'd like to share, please send us an email at reflectionsongaming@gmail.com. And we'd love to hear from you. And you never know, we might get back to you, might bring it up on the show, depending on how insightful your commentary is.
Right, and like we said, this is a fairly basic overview of everything. We're not going super deep into the ideologies behind all of this and who came up with this and how they came up with this and why they came up with this. We will link a fairly good paper written on these different ideologies so that you can follow it if you're interested. Yeah, if you want to learn a little bit more, that's a great resource. But now that we've laid that groundwork, let's talk a little bit about how that can affect our ability to play games and have fun with games. First, because I went to school for game design and development, I want to talk a little bit about how game developers can use this ideology to create a game that is interesting to these kinds of people, and then jump into how you can look at how you tend to like to play games to kind of find games that you're interested in and get the most out of the games that you already have. So one great example, as we've talked about a couple of times, is Dark Souls. Dark Souls has a lot of different things in it that allow for people to enjoy it regardless of where they lie in this player type versus temperament kind of four-square diagram. For the killers, there's invasions. You can go invade other people's worlds, smack them down, and it's quite obnoxious, but it's not going to do any serious harm to them. So you can have a great time dunking on players with less experience than you. For achievers, there's obviously the plethora of actual achievements. There also tends to be several endings, which is great for achievers because they can do different things playing through the game several times to achieve a different ending. There's a lot of different side quests. All those side quests and endings and lore and snippets that you can read up on are also great for the explorer. And on top of that, there's the actual weapons and armor that you can mess around with, see what playstyle is the best. And then, of course, socializers. Socializers, not only do they have the ability to play with their friends in these games, but they can also join the online communities that love these games and talk about them that way, you know, through forums, through Reddit, through Facebook, through whatever it is that they enjoy. So, really, Dark Souls is a fantastic display of how to achieve a game that can interact with all these kinds of players. But in doing so, it doesn't necessarily do a great job of associating with any particular player, except for maybe explorers due to the deep lore and world building that the games are often built upon. Another issue the game has is that it is touted as being extremely difficult, which, depending on your experience with games, it is very difficult, even frustrating at times. But this has caused some people to be a bit toxic when talking about the game, in that if you aren't having a good time with the game, well, screw you, you're just not a good enough player and you shouldn't be playing it either anyway, which makes it a little less fun for new socializer type players to try to get into the game. Now, of course, this isn't entirely true. Not everyone who plays the game is super toxic, but just having that does make it more difficult. for people to get into it. So with that in mind, talking about a game that has a little bit of everything, let's talk about games that really try to double down on one type of player, and kind of see how they do it and what other ancillary players they happen to pull along in their attempt to make it about one type of player.
Yeah, I think a pretty obvious example that we even talked a little bit about, and we've talked about before on the show, is Minecraft, right? Looking at just purely vanilla Minecraft, okay? Ignoring the extras that and the growth that Minecraft has undergone, just looking at vanilla Minecraft, it is quite clearly a explorer-centric game. It's all about exploring the world, figuring out what you can do in the world, figuring out, like, for some people, redstone, super big thing. People have made calculators and computers and full, like, Space Invader and Pong clones in Minecraft, and way crazier stuff than that, just with the built-in mechanics in Minecraft. And those kinds of things, you know, they may appeal to achievers. There is a bit of an achiever aspect with some of the achievements you can get in Minecraft, but at its core, I would personally say that it definitely, vanilla single player Minecraft doubles down on explorers, and it's just through all the extras that have been added onto it over the years that it's kind of branched out to the other people. But would you agree with that? Do you have any other thoughts about that?
Well, I think it's interesting. Minecraft obviously was built, and I don't believe that the original creator had any particular player set in mind when he was creating it, mostly because it seems like he was creating it just as kind of a fun thing for him to do. But as soon as it took off, it was obvious that he continued to add things to it to add to this explorer mentality. He's like, people love this because every time you start it, there's a new world to explore, and there's new things to achieve that you couldn't before. But nowadays, even within vanilla Minecraft, it's more of an artisan space. People who are artisans love to be in this world because, like you said, there's so many things that they can do. And that only expands on itself when you start adding in different components, different mods, different map packs, all these different things. And then, of course, you add in the servers and you add in the multiplayer, and you've got the socializers and the killers and all these different things. Minecraft has blown up into this massive, very marketable game because it has, in its own way, kind of become several different games. The original game was made mostly for explorers. Well, they decided, hey, explorers and achievers are very similar to each other, so let's just slap some achievements in there. Let's add an end game with the Ender Dragon, and suddenly, achievers and explorers can both really enjoy this world, and the additional components don't detract from what they love. Then they added servers. Hey, if you like these kinds of things, but you don't want to do it on your own, do it with someone else. Again, they've added something that doesn't take away from the original, but allows for a more diverse population to enjoy the game. And then finally, within those servers, there's different kinds of things that you can do, and a little bit with the Ender Dragon, you can kind of get that killer mindset of achieving something, beating other people, doing something that other people wouldn't be able to do. But more so than that, there's definitely the servers with the combat and the parkour and all these things where you can show other people that you are better than them.
Yeah, I think servers have really opened the way, is that you can find a server for definitely every one of those player types. You can find an entire scale recreation of Middle Earth, or you can, you know, it's not inherently socializing. There are a lot of servers like Mineplex where it's all games with other people, but there's also parkour that's by yourself. That's really quite a bit, you know, much more achieving than it is socializing or even exploring. Or you can do kind of vanilla type maps or skyblock type maps or rogue maps like 2B2T, where it's just the server resets every once in a while, but it's basically just a free for all, and you can kill anyone you want, or you can go so far out nobody will ever find you and build whatever you want. Like, servers truly expanded Minecraft to literally anyone can find something that fits into one of these quadrants that they'll probably enjoy for at least a little bit.
Right, a big reason for this is because the people who develop Minecraft don't create the servers. They open up the ability for other people to moderate and handle these servers. So in a sense, Minecraft, the server side, is a game engine rather than a game in of itself. People take this engine, they add on it, they change things, and they say, here's a new experience with this kind of template in place. And that's why it's able to really hone in on every kind of player, every temperament, every personality, because other people are designing these servers specifically with them in mind. Generally, they do that because they are that kind of player and they want something in that realm. And since no one else is making it, they will make it. But not every game can or does or eventually evolves into something that appeals to everyone. In a certain way, almost every game does have at least a little bit appeal to every kind of player, and that's mostly because the way that games are kind of lead into how people play them and why they play them, so it's really hard to completely segment yourself away from everything. But some games that are hyper focused on the casual and wanderer kind of segment are online first-person shooters. Their whole thing is mostly you want to play with other people, and either you want to beat them or you want to hang out with them or you want to achieve something. Whatever it is, you want to be with other people and you want to be having the ability to dominate them. Well, here's a first-person shooter where that's the entire game. Everything about this is leveling up, learning the maps, shooting other people. And back in the mid-2010s, I think, no, even earlier than that, it was obvious that that was doing very well because every year a new Call of Duty was coming out. It had a big focus on its online multiplayer and its online zombie mode where you weren't fighting other players, you were fighting enemies. But the whole thing was, whether you enjoy hanging out with people or dominating people, here's a game where you can do that, and the more you play, the better you get. And so every year they would churn them out, they would sell millions of copies, and it made people very, very happy. But as with all things, genre fatigue started to set in, and there needed to be some kind of changes to that genre to keep people interested. And what they did was they found a way to appeal to more types of players, and they created the Battle Royale, where now you've got the Wanderers, you've got the Casuals, you've got the Killers, you've got the Socializers, but you've got more of the Socializers, and now you're even getting a little bit of the hardcore audience, because there's more to the game than just picking it up, shooting people, being done. And it even gets a little bit into the explorer category because the maps have secrets. There tends to be some kind of lore surrounding why the Battle Royale is a thing in the first place. Especially with Apex Legends, they've added in the idea of all these different characters having backstories and personalities. And so you can see that game developers have really picked up on this idea of, if I can make a game for all these different player types, I will sell more copies of my game. But with that said, even though Battle Royales and a lot of other games have some of these elements in them, they're never going to get the entire audience. And it's because there are some people who just don't like those kinds of games. There's some people who, if you put in a killer aspect of the game, they're not going to like it. Or if you put in a socializer part of the game, they're not going to like it. Or people who, if there's achievements, and a lot of them, and they're difficult to get, they're not going to want to touch the game, either because they don't like thinking about achievements, or they know that they'll get sucked into them and they don't have time to do it. They'll ignore it so that they don't have those
yeah, I think
problems.
It's important to recognize, like you were talking about Dark Souls, right? How Dark Souls has certain things that appeal to everyone, but by doing so, and at the same time, they forfeit or kind of sacrifice going all in on certain types of players, and maybe don't capitalize quite enough on their main appeal and the main types of players that are going to be playing it. And the more and more that developers do that and they try to reach a wide audience, the less likely they are to really get their hardcore, to really rein in that one specific sector of players, like you're saying, because they look at certain parts of the game and they're like, well, I really like this aspect, but the fact that I am forced into doing it this specific way that fits into one of these other quadrants really turns me off to playing it. So I'm just going to stick with my other favorite game that really capitalizes on the explorer or achiever or killer or socializer aspect. So I think that's something important that developers have to keep in mind, like you said.
Right. And at this point, before we run out of time, I want to talk about how you can look at the kind of player you are, and you can get more out of the games that you're playing. And the reason I say this is because, like we just went over, most games pander to a broad audience, and even games that are targeting a very small, specific type of audience inevitably encompass a larger array of players just by being playable, just by incorporating a couple of factors that allow for people to have a more usable product. But by learning the kind of person you are, the kind of thing that you're interested in, you can get more out of your game by focusing on that aspect and or ignoring other aspects of the game. For example, we have mentioned a couple of times that neither of us are socializers when it comes to games. There's a couple of games and maybe a couple of people that we enjoy playing with. But in general, if we don't have to play with other people, we are that much happier about it. But especially nowadays, it's fairly difficult to find games that do not have some kind of social aspect in them. So we just ignore them. For example, in first-person shooters, almost every first-person shooter has some kind of online component with multiplayer. And it's like, well, I paid $60 for this game. I should get the bang for my buck. I should play the single player that I enjoy, and I should play the multiplayer. Try to, get some extra time out of this. Especially if you're used to playing RPGs that can take upwards of 50 hours, and then you play this, first-person shooter that takes 6. It's like, well, man, I got to play that multiplayer to get more time in here. No, you don't. If you don't like playing multiplayer, if you don't like playing with other people, then just don't do it. You'll enjoy the game more. You'll have more value for the game if you only play the parts that you enjoy. I mean, it's like ordering a dinner plate and getting a vegetable or a fruit or some part of the dinner plate that you don't like. And you're like, well, I got to eat it because, I paid $15 for this dinner plate. I got to get bang for my buck. It's like, yeah, but if you do that, you're going to hate yourself because you don't like that thing, or you're allergic to that thing, or whatever. It makes more sense to avoid it, to ignore it, because while you could see it as value lost, if it degrades the whole experience, it's not value lost because you're enjoying what you wanted to the maximum. So with that, let's have a couple of games that we can think of where there's ways that you can play or things that you can avoid that, depending on your player type, can help you enjoy the game more than with/without.
Yeah, I think one that I've actually been playing a little bit recently, again, because I stumbled across a novel concept like you were talking about, is Skyrim. Skyrim is packed full of content. Like, it's ridiculous. There are hundreds and hundreds of quests. There's hundreds of NPCs. There's a crazy amount of secrets. There's, hundreds and hundreds of very, very well put together mods. But I'm just like sick of it. I'm tired of starting a character with the feeling and the compulsion that, like, okay, I have to do every quest and I have to max out every skill to 100 and I have to get everything. I have to get all the dragon priest masks and I have to, that kind of stuff. That mentality, which I think a lot of people are prone to, and I'm definitely prone to. Instead, what I did was I started a character with a specific goal in mind, kind of as a I guess I'd say with a kind of achiever mindset, where I just had a single goal in mind, and as soon as I achieved that goal with my character, who I was actually trying to roleplay instead of just being a generic protagonist who wanted to do everything, I was actually I chose a race, I chose a backstory, I gave them a name based on that backstory, and gave them a goal that I actually felt like this player, this character that I'm trying to roleplay as, would go for. In this case, I was an orc who came from a colony of orcs that didn't care about magic, and he wanted to become a wizard, so they gave him a nickname, kind of a pejorative nickname called Sparkles. That's what I called him in the game. And my goal was to become the I can't remember what the name is, the Archmage of the College of Winterhold, learn all of the destruction spells in the game, and then I would just stop. And I have been way more invested in this playthrough than I have any of the last several times, because like you said, I saw the sunk cost of, like, I already bought this game. Why would I continue playing and searching every nook and cranny when it just makes me bored? Instead, I'm going to have a focus that I'm going to go for, and as soon as I achieve that goal, I can start a new character with a new goal, and I don't have to sink 150 hours into one character doing everything. I can have lots of individual experiences with different characters.
Yeah, and role-playing is actually a great way to add value to games, because you can decide, okay, now I'm playing this person, and whether it makes the game easier or harder or whatever, it just makes it more interesting to me. That tends to be something that explorers, rationals, or guardians, achievers tend to enjoy. Socializers and artists might get into that depending on exactly what it is, but they tend to more go towards challenge runs, so that they can kind of show off, or do a Twitch Let's Play or anything like that. But role-playing does do wonders for adding value to a lot of different types of games, and I think one day we'll probably talk about that, especially how interesting it is that so many people roleplay such odd characters and have such convoluted backstories.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Names.
I mean, I know what you're
like
talking
Sparkles.
about. I don't think it's applicable right now, but I understand.
I'm sure you don't think it's applicable. Anyway, another game that I think works well with this would probably be just about any RPG. If you're the kind of person who is a killer, then thinking about playing an RPG may not be for you. But if you're someone who tends to be a killer and still wants to play RPGs because there's something in it that you enjoy, well, then I'd say try not to go off the beaten path. You probably won't enjoy all the side content because it rarely affects the main storyline. Because if it did, you'd have to do it. So as a killer, as someone who's looking to kind of consume games rather than delve into them, doing a more cursory approach might be a good idea. And in fact, I've had this problem a couple of times. There are some games that I get stuck in a loop of, I don't want to move forward because what if I miss something? And this is less of a killer, more of an explorer kind of mentality. You need to watch out for traps where you suck the fun out of the game because you're trying to get the most enjoyment you can out of it. If you're spending 2 to 3 hours exploring, this tiny little cell just in case one of the pixels houses something that you need, you might be in a negative cycle that is making the game unfun for you. Now, if you're doing that and you still love the game and you don't feel like it's being tedious, then that's fine. You're not doing something that you shouldn't be. But if you're playing a game and you're like, man, I hate this and I wish I wasn't doing this, well, sometimes maybe you should just stop. A lot of times we impose things on ourselves because we think it will make it more fun. We think we will get enjoyment out of it, and we don't. I think I used to be of the opinion that certain games you need to play kind of unspoiled. You need to play games without looking up any guides online or anything to ensure that you can have the most fun in it. And sometimes that's just not true. The first time I played Dragon Quest VIII, I did not enjoy my time with it. And the problem is that I didn't understand how to build a character. The RPGs that I had been playing up until then were Final Fantasy and other games very similar to Final Fantasy, where generally you don't have to worry about allocating your resources incorrectly. As long as you grind, you're pretty set. In Dragon Quest, this is not the case, and it's very difficult to grind because it takes a very long time to level up, and leveling up, unless you allocate your skill points correctly, won't really make your character all that much more powerful. So I played the game, I got a couple hours into it, and I just wasn't having a good time because I kept getting crushed by enemies. So the next time I'm like, Dragon Quest VIII, Dragon Quest as a series is supposed to be really, really good, and Dragon Quest VIII is supposed to be one of the best entries in the series. So, I like RPGs. I've got to figure out how to have fun with this. Well, I did two things. One, I looked up how to skill, like what skills I should be investing in. And two, I looked up how to craft some of the more powerful items in the game. And this allowed me to do two things. One, I had a plan beforehand on what I was going to do to be able to complete the game in a way that I enjoyed. And it let me just kind of ignore some of the extraneous exploration that I tend to do to try to find every last thing. Since I knew what I needed, I didn't have to explore everything. I just had to explore enough to find those things. And I'm really glad I did that because I love Dragon Quest VIII. I spent 80 hours playing that game and getting the true ending, and I do not regret anything about it. And I think sometimes as gamers, we get stuck in a mindset of, I have to play it this way. And no, you don't. You play it the way that you can have the most amount of fun.
Sorry, go for it.
And I think the most important thing to remember is that these ideologies don't stop just with video games. It can be the same for a lot of things in your life. If you're doing something that you don't have to be doing and it's making your life worse, evaluate if you can stop it or if you can change something about it to enjoy more of what you're doing.
Games are fun. Make them fun. Play them in ways that are fun for you. And as Jordan said, very philosophically, and as Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. So examine your life and figure out what's not worth living, and live the things that are good for you and fun and make you happy. And that goes doubly for video games. Play the ones that make you happy. If you have,
when you're spending money on something that at the end of the day doesn't really matter, make sure that you're getting some kind of enjoyment out of it. Because if you're spending money on video games and you're not enjoying your time with them, something is wrong.
That being said, we're out of time. But if you've been entertained, informed, or inspired by this podcast, let us know. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Again, please send them to reflectionsongaming@gmail.com. And please leave a rating and review for this podcast wherever you're getting your podcast, whether it's on YouTube, whether you're listening to this on YouTube, or whether you're listening to it as a podcast, wherever you're getting it. Please, it really helps us reach more people and helps our community grow. And the more people we have, the more conversations we can start and the more intriguing ideas we can get flowing.
And with that, thanks for listening. We hope you
Bye.
listen in next time.